The evacuation sirens wailed across the settlement of Meridian as Jacob pressed his face against the cracked window of his grandfather's study, watching the sky turn from blue to an angry orange. The massive shadow descending through the clouds like a dark god come to collect debts owed long ago, and the people below scattered like insects fleeing from a falling stone, screaming names and running toward shelters that suddenly seemed far too small for the terror that gripped their hearts. Jacob was only 12 years old, but he understood fear in a way most children never would. The kind of fear that came from watching grown people lose control, from hearing his mother's voice shake as she told him to stay inside and not look outside, no matter what sounds he heard from the streets beyond. From the way his grandfather stood in the doorway with his hands trembling and his eyes distant, as if he were remembering something terrible from his own childhood. The dragon landed in the clearing 3 miles from the settlement, a creature so enormous that Jacob's mind struggled to make sense of its size. Scales the color of midnight and storm clouds, wings that cast shadows stretching for miles, a tail that could have torn through buildings like they were made of paper. And the alien forces from the orbital station began their assault almost immediately. Weapons fire lighting up the sky in brilliant lines of red and blue. Jacob's grandfather, whose name was Samuel, shuffled over to a cluttered shelf and pulled down a collection of leather journals and old containers, filled with artifacts from archaeological digs, things the scientists at the colony had deemed worthless long ago. Broken trinkets and strange objects that no one could identify or understand. His weathered hands moving with the careful precision of someone who had spent his entire life studying ancient mysteries. "Look at this, Jacob," Samuel said, his voice surprisingly calm despite the violence raging outside, pulling down a brass necklace that seemed to gleam with an inner light despite its obvious age. Scratches and dents covering its surface. Strange symbols carved into the metal that shifted slightly when viewed from different angles. "I'd found this years ago on the western dig, and the council said it was meaningless, but I have never believed that. Nothing in this galaxy is truly meaningless, Samuel. Some things just wait for the right moment to reveal their purpose." Jacob took the necklace carefully, his young fingers tracing the symbols as his grandfather returned to the window. The sounds of the battle growing louder now, explosions echoing across the landscape. The settlement's meager defense systems firing upward in desperate attempts to slow the creature's advance. But the dragons seemed barely affected by their weapons, moving with an almost graceful lethargy, as if it knew the outcome already, and had no need to rush. The necklace felt warm in Jacob's hands, warmer than it should have been, and he looked down at it with confusion, wondering why his grandfather would show him an old artifact when the colony was under attack, when they should be running to the shelters like his mother had instructed. But Samuel had always been different, always more concerned with understanding the mysteries of the galaxy than with the immediate dangers that surrounded them. The dragon stopped its advance 3 miles from the settlement, and to the shock of everyone watching, it did not attack, did not charge forward to destroy everything in its path as everyone had feared. Instead, it simply stood there, massive and still and terrible, waiting for something, its head turning slightly as if searching for something specific, something important. And Jacob felt his grandfather's hand on his shoulder, gripping him tightly. The military commander of the settlement, a woman named Captain Sarah, ordered all civilians to the shelters immediately and began directing troops to establish defensive positions around the perimeter, her voice crackling through the communication system with the calm authority of someone trained to lead people through catastrophe. And Jacob could hear the fear underneath her professionalism, the knowledge that humanity had no weapons capable of truly threatening this creature, that they were preparing for a last stand they could never win. Jacob's mother, Victoria, came rushing into the study then, her face flushed with panic, grabbing Jacob and telling him they had to go now. They had to get to the shelters, but Samuel stood calmly holding his journals, seemingly unmoved by the urgency in her voice. And when she asked him why he was not moving, why he was not taking his responsibility to his grandson seriously, he simply smiled and said something that would haunt Jacob for the rest of his life. "The dragon has come looking for something," Samuel said quietly. "Something important, something lost. I think before this day is through, my grandson may be the only one in this entire settlement who understands what it truly wants." Jacob did not understand his grandfather's words then, did not comprehend how an old man could speak with such certainty about a creature that everyone said wanted only destruction and death. But he clutched the necklace tighter as his mother pulled him toward the door, the warmth of it spreading through his palm, like a secret being whispered directly to his skin. The descent into the shelter was chaos. Families pushing past each other, people crying and calling out names. The sound of the seal door closing above them, cutting off the view of the sky and leaving them in artificial light and recycled air. And Jacob sat in the corner of the cramped space with the necklace hidden beneath his shirt, feeling it pulse with a rhythm that matched his racing heartbeat. While above them, the dragon waited in the night, patient and still, as if it knew exactly where the boy with the necklace was hiding. The shelter was cold and uncomfortable, filled with the sounds of people trying to stay quiet and calm when every instinct screamed at them to panic. Children whispering to their parents, adults staring at walls with expressions that showed they were thinking about anything except where they were. And Jacob sat alone in a corner, the necklace hidden beneath his shirt as a secret that felt heavier than the metal should ever weigh hours passed in the shelter, measured not by clocks, but by the subtle shifts in how people stood, how their faces changed, how the hope in their eyes either grew or diminished. Captain Sarah came through with reports that made no sense to Jacob. The dragon had not attacked, had barely moved, was simply sitting outside the settlement boundary as if waiting for permission to proceed. And this strangeness created a new kind of fear in the shelter, the fear of the unknown. The fear of not understanding what an enemy wanted. Jacob could not sleep that night. Though many around him attempted to rest on the uncomfortable metal benches and cold concrete floors, his mind was racing with questions about what his grandfather had said, about how Samuel had seemed to know something that no one else understood. And when the sounds from above became quieter and less frequent, when the darkness of true night settled over the settlement, Jacob found himself thinking about his grandmother, about how she had been injured when the military was setting up defensive positions, about how she was in the medical section of the shelter somewhere, and he had not even asked if she was all right around midnight, when the shelter was as quiet as it would ever be. Jacob stood up carefully and made his way through the sleeping bodies toward his grandfather. Samuel sat against the wall with his eyes open, staring at nothing, and when Jacob approached, the old man looked down at him with an expression of such profound sadness that it almost broke the young boy's heart. "Sit with me," Samuel whispered, and Jacob obeyed, settling beside his grandfather. And the old man reached over and placed his weathered hand on Jacob's chest, directly over the necklace hidden beneath the shirt. "You still have it," he said, and Jacob nodded, not understanding what this meant. But knowing it was important, Samuel leaned closer and spoke so quietly that Jacob had to lean in to hear. "When I found that necklace in the ruins of the old settlement, the Archaeological Council told me it was decorative, that it held no purpose or meaning. But I have studied ancient languages and symbols for 60 years of my life, Jacob, and I know that those markings are not decorative. They are functional. They are a key to something. I never knew what until tonight, when I saw that creature and remembered the old stories from the time before the settlement. Stories that the council buried because they did not fit the approved history. What stories?" "Grandfather," Jacob asked, and Samuel looked around to make sure no one else was listening. Then he told Jacob about the old records he had found decades ago in the deepest archives. Records that spoke of ancient races that had created guardians to protect younger civilizations from the threats in the void. Races that were so powerful and so wise that they had faded from the galaxy long ago, leaving only their creations behind. And one of those creations, according to the old records, had been captured and imprisoned by other alien races who feared its power. And those who imprisoned it had given false names to all the younger races, calling the Guardian something terrible, calling it a weapon, calling it a monster. Jacob's heart was pounding as he listened to his grandfather speak. And Samuel continued, telling him that the necklace was made by those ancient creators, made to communicate across vast distances, made so that someone could hear the truth directly from the source, not filtered through the lies of empires and councils. And if Jacob was brave enough and willing to listen, the necklace would teach him things that might change everything that night. Jacob could not sleep, even beside his grandfather. And when exhaustion finally began to pull at his mind in those hours before dawn, he found himself holding the necklace in his hand, the metal warm against his palm, and he whispered a question into the darkness, wondering if anything could actually hear him, wondering if he was just a foolish boy clutching an old piece of metal, while above him a monster waited to destroy his world. The response came like nothing Jacob had ever experienced. Not a voice exactly, but something like thoughts that were not his own. Something like emotion translated into understanding. Something vast and ancient and unimaginably lonely. And the message it carried was simple but overwhelming. Please listen. Please understand. I did not come here to destroy. I came because I felt this calling. This linked to something lost long ago. And when I arrived, I found myself surrounded by weapons and fear, and all the same lies that have hunted me across the galaxy for 1,000 years. Jacob gasped and pulled back, his hand shaking, the necklace slipping from his grasp and falling against his chest. And he looked around the shelter to see if anyone else had heard what he had heard. But everyone was asleep, and his grandfather was watching him with knowing eyes, an expression of profound understanding on his ancient face. Now you know, Samuel said simply, and now the choice is yours, my grandson. The question is no longer whether the dragon is dangerous or safe. The question is whether you are brave enough to believe something different from what everyone around you believes. Whether you are willing to stand alone if you must. And Jacob felt the weight of that choice settle on his shoulders, like a burden that had never been meant for a 12-year-old boy. 2 days passed in the shelter before the military decided it was safe enough to allow limited people to return to their homes. And Jacob spent those 2 days in a strange state of existence, hearing the dragon's voice occasionally through the necklace, feeling emotions that were not his own, understanding slowly that the massive creature waiting outside the settlement was not the monster everyone believed it to be, but something far more complex and far more tragic than anyone could have imagined. When the shelter doors finally opened and people began the slow process of returning to the surface, Jacob made a decision that he knew was dangerous and foolish and absolutely necessary. He would sneak away from his family and go directly to where the dragon waited. He would see it with his own eyes and hear its voice, not through metal, but directly, face to face. And if he was wrong about what the necklace was telling him, if the dragon truly was a weapon designed to destroy everything in its path, then at least he would know the truth from his own experience rather than from the propaganda of the military. And to counsel his opportunity came late that afternoon, when Captain Sarah arrived at his family's home to check on their status and to update them on the settlement's defense preparations. While his mother and the captain were speaking in the living room, discussing fortifications and supply chains, Jacob slipped out through the back entrance and made his way toward the mountains, moving carefully and quietly, staying away from the main paths where other people might see him and force him to turn back the journey took him through the edge of the settlement and into the natural landscape beyond. A landscape that had been transformed by the dragon's presence. Trees were bent, but not broken. The ground was compressed, but not destroyed. And everything smelled strange, like ozone and something that Jacob could not identify. Something ancient and powerful and deeply sad. The closer he got to where the dragon waited, the stronger the emotions became through the necklace. And Jacob realized that he was not just hearing thoughts. He was absorbing feelings directly from the creature's mind. Loneliness so profound it felt like drowning. Loss so deep it seemed to have no bottom, and something that might have been hope. Fragile and barely surviving after countless disappointments, when Jacob finally crested a ridge and saw the dragon clearly in daylight for the first time. His breath caught in his throat. The creature was even larger than it had appeared during the landing. But it was not the monstrous thing he had been expecting. The scales were not black as they had appeared from a distance, but a deep purple that shimmered with colors like oil on water. Blues and greens and gold swirling across the surface when the creature moved. The eyes were enormous but intelligent, ancient, and kind in a way that Jacob had never seen in any living thing. And the dragon's wings folded carefully against its body, making itself smaller, less threatening. When it sensed Jacob's approach, the boy froze halfway down the slope, unsure if he should continue forward or retreat. But the dragon's thoughts came through the necklace again, warm and gentle, telling him it was safe, that it meant him no harm, that it was grateful beyond measure that someone had finally chosen to listen, that someone had believed there might be more to its story than the simple narrative of destruction. Jacob walked forward slowly, his legs shaking with fear and wonder, and a strange sense of destiny that he did not fully understand. And as he approached, the dragon lowered its enormous head to bring its face closer to the boy's. And Jacob could see himself reflected in those ancient eyes. Could see not a small, frightened child, but a person who had made a choice that was larger than himself. My name in your language would be close to guardian. The dragon's thought came through clearer now that Jacob was so close. But your people call me dragon, and so I have become that to you. I was created millennia ago by a civilization that understood how to protect the fragile new species that were beginning to rise across the galaxy. My purpose was to watch for threats from the void, to protect those who could not protect themselves. And my creators gave me the ability to communicate across vast distances, to teach and guide and help. Jacob found his voice, rough and uncertain. Why did you come here, to Meridian? Why did you come to our settlement? And the dragon's response came back almost immediately. Because your necklace has been calling to me since the day I sensed it on this planet. I have traveled across the galaxy for centuries, looking for the ancient technology that would allow me to speak to someone, to finally tell the truth after so many lies. Your people imprisoned me for 500 years. Jacob, in a cold station in deep space, telling other races I was a weapon, telling them I had destroyed entire civilizations, when the truth was that I was trying to protect them from things they did not yet understand. The dragon showed Jacob images then, memories transferred through the necklace of ancient wars and dead civilizations, of threats moving through the void toward young worlds, of the dragon moving between planets and star systems, saving entire species from extinction, and of the day when rival powers had decided that the dragon's power was too great, too uncontrollable, and had imprisoned it, replacing its story with lies, painting it as a monster rather than a savior. Jacob felt tears on his cheeks and did not know when he had started crying. But he understood now the weight of what was happening. He had been chosen to be a bridge between two worlds, between fear and understanding, between the lies that everyone believed and the truth that only he could access. And he knew that his next actions would determine not just his own fate, but potentially the fate of his entire world. The dragon lowered itself further, until it was resting on the ground, and Jacob reached out his small hand and touched the scaled face before him, feeling the warmth and the life flowing through the ancient creature, understanding in that moment that his grandfather had been right all along, that this being was not a monster waiting to destroy them, but something precious and rare that the universe itself had deemed worthless. And Jacob made a decision that would change everything. Jacob spent the next 3 days going to the mountains in secret, meeting with the dragon and learning everything the ancient creature could teach him. The dragon showed him records of civilizations that had risen and fallen, explained the nature of the void and the threats that moved within it, described the architecture of the galaxy and the balance of power between races that humans could barely comprehend. And with each meeting, Jacob's conviction grew stronger that he had to find a way to make everyone else understand what he understood, that the dragon was not a threat but a guardian, and that the colony's only hope for survival was to choose trust over fear. But when Jacob tried to tell his parents what he had learned, his mother became furious, telling him that he was not to leave the house again, that he was engaging in dangerous fantasy, that the dragon was a monster, and the military was going to handle the situation properly. His father had been killed in an accident 3 years earlier, and his mother was overprotective to the point of paranoia. She could not listen to Jacob's explanations because her fear was too overwhelming, too all-consuming, and so Jacob learned that truth alone was not enough to change minds, that people believed what they wanted to believe, and sometimes showing them the evidence required a level of courage that most people could not access that night. Jacob overheard a conversation between Captain Sarah and his mother when the captain came to update them on the military's progress. He learned that the orbital forces had given an ultimatum: destroy the dragon within 1 week or face a bombardment that would eliminate the creature regardless of the cost to the settlement. The dragon would die, but so would everyone who lived near it. And the military had decided that this was an acceptable price for the safety of the galaxy. Jacob felt his stomach drop with the weight of that knowledge. He had less than 7 days to convince an entire colony that everything they believed about the dragon was a lie. Jacob began recording the dragon's communications, using a small device that his grandfather had given him, a scanner that could translate the necklace's signals into audio format, creating files that he could play back to others, trying to find irrefutable evidence that the dragon was intelligent and peaceful and communicating in good faith. But even as he created these recordings, he knew that people who did not want to believe would find ways to dismiss them as forgeries or manipulations or tricks. On the 5th day of the ultimatum, Jacob realized that he was running out of time and that subtle approaches had failed. His parents had not listened, his teachers had not listened, the colony leaders had not listened, and everyone was still preparing for the moment when the bombardment would begin and the dragon would be destroyed along with hundreds of humans who lived in the outer settlements. Jacob made a decision that his grandfather would have called desperate and his mother would have called suicidal. And Jacob decided that sometimes desperate times required desperate actions. The colony's main communications hub was located in the central dome, where all broadcasts were controlled and all signals were sent to the orbital stations and beyond. Jacob had been there once with his grandfather on an educational tour. He remembered the layout, remembered where the backup terminals were located, remembered that late at night the facility was staffed by only 3 people, mostly watching automated systems while they waited for their shifts to end. Jacob waited until late evening, when darkness had fully settled over the colony. Then he made his way to the communications hub, moving quietly through empty streets, his heart pounding in his chest so hard he was sure everyone could hear it. The necklace hung beneath his shirt, and the dragon's presence was calm beside him through the connection, offering encouragement and support for what Jacob was about to do, knowing that the boy's actions might result in his capture or punishment or worse, but that it was necessary if anyone was going to understand the truth When Jacob reached the communications hub, he found the back entrance unlocked. The facility was so confident in its security that it had not occurred to anyone that a 12-year-old boy might attempt something this bold. Jacob crept inside and made his way to the backup terminal room, where he knew he could access the broadcast systems without being immediately detected. His fingers shook as he worked through the authentication codes that his grandfather had taught him, codes that were supposed to be secret, codes that opened doors that should have remained closed to civilians. The moment Jacob activated the broadcast override, alarms began to sound throughout the facility, and he knew he had minutes at most before security would arrive. He began uploading the Dragon's recorded messages directly into the colony-wide broadcast system. Every screen in every building would receive the signal. Every speaker would carry the Dragon's voice, and there would be no way to suppress it or deny it or make it go away. Jacob heard footsteps running toward his location, heard someone shouting into a communication device, and he typed as fast as his young fingers could move, pushing the final files through just as the security officers burst into the room. One of them grabbed him and lifted him away from the terminal. But it was too late. The broadcast was already spreading through the colony, and Jacob felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. He had done it. He had told the truth in the only way that he could. The Dragon's presence flooded through the necklace then, and Jacob felt love radiating from the ancient creature. Something so profound and so genuine that it almost hurt. The Dragon told him through the connection that his bravery had given hope to something that had stopped believing in hope long ago. And Jacob, being dragged away by security, being arrested for crimes against the colony's security, understood that his life was about to change forever. What Jacob did not know as he was being taken into custody was that across the entire colony, people were watching the broadcast with their own eyes, hearing the Dragon's voice with their own ears, and slowly, carefully, beginning to question everything they had been told. Some would continue to believe the military's narrative, but others, for the first time, would begin to wonder if they had been wrong. And that seed of doubt, planted by a 12-year-old boy's impossible courage, would grow into something that could shift the entire balance of power in the coming hours. Jacob sat in a holding cell beneath the communications hub. Not a prison exactly, but a secure room used for detaining people suspected of major crimes against the colony. And he waited to learn what his punishment would be. Hours passed, and he heard nothing. No one came to tell him what charges he faced or what his fate might be. And in that silence, Jacob had plenty of time to think about what he had done and whether he regretted it. He decided that he did not regret it, that he would make the same choice again if he had to, and that knowing he had told the truth was worth whatever consequence came next above the colony. Captain Sarah stood in the military command center and watched the broadcast replay across all the screens. Her officers wanted her to order Jacob's immediate execution as a traitor to the colony, but she was hesitating, because the Dragon's words in the broadcast were not the words of a weapon or a monster. They were the words of something intelligent and ancient and genuinely seeking peace. And Sarah was a soldier, which meant she understood the difference between propaganda and truth. She had served under leaders who had lied to her before, and she had vowed never to follow orders that violated her own sense of what was right. The orbital station transmitted a message that Commander Harrison on the station was ordering the destruction of the Dragon to proceed immediately, regardless of the colony's objections. That they had given the deadline and the Dragon remained, and therefore the bombardment would commence in 6 hours to destroy both the Dragon and the settlement that was sheltering it. And Captain Sarah listened to those orders and made a decision that would define the rest of her life. Sarah ordered her soldiers to stand down from combat readiness. She instructed them to lower their weapons and remove the firing blocks from the defensive positions. And when her officers protested and demanded that she explain her actions, She simply told them that she was about to teach them something that the military often forgot. That soldiers were human beings first and following orders second. And that some orders were simply wrong. Jacob did not know what was happening above him until the cell door opened and his grandfather entered. Samuel looked older than he had ever looked before, and his expression was a mixture of pride and concern and love that made Jacob want to cry. The old man embraced his grandson and told him that what he had done was the bravest thing anyone in the colony had ever attempted, that the broadcast had reached not just the settlement but the orbital station as well, that half the military now believed the dragon was not a threat, and that Captain Sarah had done something extraordinary 6 hours later. Just as the bombardment was about to commence, the dragon moved, but not to attack. Not to defend itself, but to save the colony. Because in those 6 hours a fleet of predatory vessels had entered the system, drawn by the broadcast signal, hoping to find and capture the dragon that they had been hunting for 300 years. Creatures that wanted the dragon's power for themselves. That would have destroyed everyone in the colony to get access to it. And the dragon revealed itself to be exactly what it had claimed, a guardian, a protector. Something capable of power and majesty beyond human comprehension. The dragon rose into the sky with a speed that defied its enormous size. And Jacob, released from his cell at Captain Sarah's direct order, ran to the observation deck to watch as the ancient creature moved through space like poetry made manifest. The predatory fleet unleashed weapons that could destroy planets, and the dragon met each attack with shields of pure energy that had been created by civilizations long dead and forgotten. The dragon fought with intelligence and precision, using only enough force to repel the threats without causing unnecessary destruction, and within an hour, the predatory fleet had been driven back beyond the system's outer boundaries when the dragon returned to the settlement. It landed directly in the central square, and Jacob felt his fear and worry transform into wonder as he realized that the colony was safe. Not just temporarily, but fundamentally, the dragon had proven itself to be not a threat but a savior, and the military commander on the orbital station who had ordered the bombardment realized that he had almost caused the genocide of his own people because of decisions made by others far away who did not understand that situation. On the ground, the Galactic Council launched an investigation into what had happened on Meridian, and they brought in experts to study the necklace and understand its technology. Those experts discovered that the necklace was a masterwork of engineering, created by a civilization that had transcended physical form. That it was not just a communication device, but a translator that could allow any intelligent being to understand the true intent and emotion behind another being's actions. They realized that they had been wrong about the dragon all along. That centuries of mistakes had been built on a foundation of lies. Jacob was not punished for his actions. He was instead offered the role of official liaison between the dragon and the human colony, a position that carried respect and responsibility and purpose. And his grandfather stood beside him when the colony leaders formally recognized him as the bridge between worlds. Samuel placed his hand on Jacob's shoulder and whispered that this was what he had always known would happen. That Jacob had been chosen to be something more than just a boy. He had been chosen to begin a new era. 3 years passed, and Jacob grew older and wiser. The dragon remained on Meridian not as an exile or a prisoner, but as a teacher and guardian. And Jacob spent his time learning from the ancient creature, learning languages and science and the history of the galaxy, learning what it meant to protect others, even when protection required sacrifice. And slowly other colonies began to develop relationships with species they had previously feared, because Jacob's example showed that understanding could overcome prejudice, that listening could transform fear into partnership. On the day of the grand celebration marking 5 years since the dragon's arrival on Meridian, Jacob stood beside his friend and guardian in the central square. now much larger and filled with humans and aliens from dozens of worlds. And children, both human and non-human, ran together and played without fear or prejudice, learning from each other and discovering that difference was not something to fear, but something to celebrate. Jacob looked up at the dragon, and through the necklace that he still wore, felt emotions of profound contentment and gratitude. And he understood in that moment that what had started as an act of desperation and bravery had become something far greater. He had given an ancient being a second chance at life, and in return that ancient being had given his entire world the gift of understanding that sometimes the monsters we fear most are just misunderstood guardians waiting for someone brave enough to listen.